Hi, Vivien. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Your book, Kino and Kinder, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a rather fascinating book. I read about it this morning on the website that you sent me the link to. Before we get into the book, though, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you come to the point where you've written this book?
Yes, well, I trained as a biologist and did biology research for many years in plant genetics and growing cultured human skin for burns patients. Then I moved sideways into teaching and taught genetics. And then I moved into teaching study skills and learning development. And technology just appeared at that time. So I moved into e-learning, learning technologies and information literacy, and began helping other people use information literacy and learning technologies in their teaching. And I've worked at quite a few universities in British universities over my career. And then I ended up without a day job, slightly unexpectedly. And my dad, because he was a refugee and he wanted to acknowledge the help of the committee that had set up the hostel that cared for the girls that came over on the kinder transport, and actually had ended up caring for him because he lived with some of the committee members and his mother as well, my grandmother. And so he wanted to write a report to acknowledge what they'd done. And this was just before he died in 2000. And I helped him. When he died, I acquired the file that had got all the letters that these girls, now as old ladies, had written. And they wrote really movingly about leaving their families as young children and what they'd done as they got older, and their own families and their careers. And also there were their contact details. So I wrote or emailed to some of them and had the privilege of meeting and talking to them. So that was one strand. The other thing my dad did when he died, was he left a cardboard box of family photographs that he sorted them like Herman, Peter's dad, Paula, Peter's mom, Peter's family, which actually wasn't all that helpful because I realized I didn't know who these people were. And he left some manuscripts he hadn't published and an intriguing attaché case, which turned out to have letters between him and his mother throughout the war and after the war. They were complete random, and fortunately, my grandmother started writing English very quickly. But they weren't all dated and they weren't all complete. So I began sort of sorting all this out. And the first thing I did as a geneticist was start building a family tree. And there were people I just didn't know existed. So I found I had a great aunt I'd never really known about. And then we got more and more information and started putting together a timeline. And I started meeting the old ladies. And well, then lockdown happened. And well, one thing that happened was that my husband and I went to Vienna, and I very, very cheekily emailed the owners. I knew where the flat was. It's a really posh apartment. And so I emailed all the owners of every apartment in that block explaining, and we had one invitation for coffee and homemade strudel. And that turned out to be my grandmother's flat. And they were quite intrigued about the story and had actually been to the archive. So when I said something, they brought out this carrier bag of papers from the archives. And our trip to Vienna ended up being running around the metro, visiting archives. These people very kindly told us how to get to my grandfather's grave and things like that. And after we got back to England, the archives went on sending great bushels of papers, which was very, very generous of them. So there was that information. And I also contacted Heinz and Helen Rupertsberger, who were the conservators of the Joseph Stapp Jewish database. And I asked about my grandmother's cinema, and I asked what I thought was an easy question, like, how can I find out what happened to the cinema after the war? And 2 weeks later, I got a message from Heinz saying, my wife has photographed 120 documents and put them in Dropbox. So if you'd like to pick them up, here is a timeline of the events. And it was all in English because I don't really speak German. And they have obviously become friends and answered vast numbers of rather idiotic questions from me. So by then we had lockdown and I had rather a lot of information and just started putting it together. What started as a detective story sort of ended up as the book.
Well, it's very important to keep this portion of history alive, as we have heard, never forget. So I'm really glad that you had the opportunity to put it all in order. Now, about your grandmother's cinema, that was a theater where they played movies. Is that, do I understand correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
My grandmother's family came from Brno, which was the capital of Moravia. And they were drapers. They had 3 shops in the main square. And my grandmother was very tiny and very beautiful with a huge personality. And she made the mistake a lot of pretty girls make of marrying the first man who would take her to Vienna. And it was a disaster. He was unfaithful, dissolute, spent all her dowry. And she had a baby. And when she realized he was unfaithful, she sort of grabbed the baby and got on the train and went back to her parents. So she was early 20s, a young mother. I think she was probably found a clinging toddler very trying. Mm. And somehow she persuaded the family that what they really needed was a cinema in Vienna. And none of us know how or why she did that. You know, we know why, because she was mad about the cinema. We don't know how. But she and her elder sister Zelma went back to Vienna, and the family had bought the Palast Kino, which is on Josefstadter Strasse. And yes, it was a cinema, but it also did vaudeville, and it had a stage and a proscenium, and so it did vaudeville and other things. And it was silent movies till 1930, and they went into sound very quickly. The cinema is now, it was sold in the 70s, it's now a supermarket. But if you go into the supermarket, you can see the outline of the cinema in the ceiling. You can see where the balcony was. And if you go around the back, you can see what was the exit. And there are lots of, like many Viennese apartments, behind the facade, there's lots and lots of apartments where people live.
Okay. When did your grandmother finally leave Austria? Because Austria was the first to be Anschlussed, if I'm not mistaken. So
it was annexed in the Anschluss.
Yes, it was the first one too, early on.
That was very sudden in sort of March 38. They were not allowed. Germany was not allowed to annex Austria as part of the Versailles Treaty after the First World War. Right. But by then they just marched across the border, across Austria and into Vienna. Now, as it happens, by then my father had come along, so there was a teenage, my dad. My grandfather had died in a road traffic accident, and so grandmother and Peter, my dad, actually, because the flat overlooks the Ringstrasse, it's a really big road with the Grand Palais and the Opera House and things. And the flat's almost opposite the university. So they were on the 3rd floor on these huge windows and standing horrified. They actually watched Hitler march in, and the formations and the incredibly clean goose-stepping officers. And at that point, she realized that at least she had to send her son to safety. His half-brother was already in London because he was a rep of an engineering company. And he was writing saying that, London, Streatham, which was then quite a sort of new suburb, it wasn't entirely the country, it wasn't entirely London, but it was lovely. And the streets were almost paved with gold. So she sent Peter to his half-brother. And he was 17 in a couple of weeks and made the journey on his own across Europe to England, where of course he found that his half-brother actually had been made redundant because the factory had been taken over by Germans and was making armaments. So they no longer needed a rep in England. So in fact, they hadn't liked to worry mum, their mum, but in fact they were living in very hand-to-mouth existence. He got Eric got whatever work he could.
Yeah.
She used the money that was paid following the car accident, the compensation, which was there to support my dad till he was 20, 21, while he was at school. She used that money to pay his exit taxes. Now, in her case, it was much harder because her only asset was the cinema. Her sister had just been widowed and wasn't in any position to leave. The flat was rented. Every other Jew in Vienna was trying to sell their furniture. So, and the exit taxes kept going up. Valuations of the cinema kept coming down. And she had to run around all these places getting the certificates, which would only last a month. And if your month ran out, you had to start again and go back and get that one. You had to get visas to cross Germany. You had to prove you paid every single tax they could think of. Basically, the Nazis didn't mind if Jews left, provided they left with nothing at that stage.
So let me just ask a question. Exit taxes. I think I know what you mean by that, but just for people watching this, can you describe what that is?
They had all sorts of imaginative things. You had to prove that you'd paid your income tax. You had to prove you paid all your business taxes. You had to pay a tax to leave, which was always going up. You were allowed to take the furnishings from one room, and you were allowed to send those. That physically you could take one small valise and about £10. So you definitely had to go with nothing. And I can remember my grandmother saying that once the goods in this room were in packing cases, and the soldiers just came in and stuck their rifle butts into the china, which must have been terrifying for her.
Of course.
So she came. You came with very little.
Yeah. Such cruelties associated with that time period in Europe. So much cruelty. Now, the Kinder transport. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a system set up between the Jews of Europe and England, where they were sent. Is that right?
It was set up very, very quickly.
Right.
Following Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht, it's now called the November Pogrom. Basically, it was an orchestrated riot where they rampaged across Germany and Austria, smashing synagogues and shop fronts of Jewish businesses. Where they set fire to the synagogues.
Yeah.
And so that it's known as the night of broken glass, because people kept, in the morning, it was all broken glass on the pavement.
That's right.
This got a lot of publicity in England, actually, and in America as well. And the Kinder transport system was set up incredibly. The first transport was 3 weeks later. And the idea was it would take unaccompanied children between about 5 and 15. So their parents, or quite often it was another family member, so that they weren't, nobody was upset. And they take them to a mainline station. So that was Germany, Austria, and later Czechoslovakia. And the children would be accompanied by complete stranger adults, volunteers. They had the famous luggage labels put around their necks. And they were transported to Holland, and several of them said how lovely the Dutch were and gave them cake and food and things. And then sea to England, and they were either taken to mainline stations, or occasionally they were taken to a reused holiday camp. And they went to either families or hostels. It was all done by charity. There wasn't government funding for this. In fact, they had to pay £50 per child allegedly towards their return fare. I mean, I think initially it was all thought of as temporary.
So once they got to England, though, later on, they must have experienced some of the bombing that England took a beating by the Germans for a while.
No, they did not so much, because the children that I know as old ladies, they were destined for a hostel in Tynemouth, which is just outside Newcastle.
Okay.
And it's actually opposite the sea. It's a lovely big domestic house, which would have been quite small when you've got 25 or 30 girls and 2 matrons in it.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as the heavy bombing started, they were told to evacuate. They were given 3 weeks to relocate out of the defence zone, and they moved actually to Windermere in the Lake District. So yes, they might have experienced bombing. Certainly the girls wrote about horrible gas masks and having to go into the shelter, but it was minimised by evacuation, because there was a lot of evacuating city dwellers anyway, or the children.
What happened to the children who went to Holland?
Oh, they went straight through Holland, were put on the boat and came to England. They didn't stay in Holland.
No.
It's just that I've read the children saying how kind the Dutch were to them, and they'd come from Germany or Austria, where you were terrified of the police and the army and the SS and things.
Mm-hmm.
And there were these nice people in Holland giving them chocolates and cakes.
Mm-hmm. Now, your grandmother, did you ever hear her talk about the years leading up to 1938 and the stress and tension and the news that was being said about what's going on in Germany and how possibly that could affect Austria?
Not so much, no. I mean, she talked about the lovely life she'd had with my grandfather, and the balls they went to, and the cinema, and it was a very glittery life. She was widowed very young, so I think from then on her life went to sort of working in she always worked, so she went on running the cinema and looking after the kids. Well, my dad and his much older half brother.
Mm-hmm.
No, she didn't really talk about deteriorating conditions and things like that. There were, although she talked about a lot of things, there were a lot of things she didn't talk about, if that makes sense.
Sure. When did you finish writing this book? When was it published?
It actually came out last year. So yeah, last year. Okay. 2022, 23.
Is this the first book you've written?
Yes, it's the first book I've written. I've written quite a lot of academic papers and book chapters and things like that within different disciplines, but it's certainly the first book.
Yeah. Any plans to write any more?
I don't know.
No.
I like writing, and I'm never going to have another story like that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not going. I just don't know yet. I'm waiting for something to come along.
You had this edited professionally, I take it?
Yes, it was I2I Publishing. I wanted a review process.
Okay.
And I2I gave me Mark Cripps, who's completely lovely and very much helped me. He was very clear that he wanted it to remain my book and he wanted it to be mine. He was also very clear that I could not have 122 footnotes and expect anyone to read it. Mm-hmm. And so also he suggested that perhaps 50 pages was rather long for a chapter. Mm. So although he kept my original, it follows the timeline of the history. Yeah. But he did a brilliant job of dividing it up into much smaller chapters and integrating the footnotes. Yeah. And he did I think one of his great contributions was making clear where I wasn't clear, or making it clear, just that he went back and said he queried something, and you go back and you look at it and go, oh yeah, he's quite right. That doesn't really make sense. So yes, I had that help.
Good. Good. I take it that in your book you have photographs, having mentioned that there were so many.
Lots. Because I'd got this box of amazing photographs.
Right.
So there's over 80 pictures. Many of them are, fantastic studio photographs
Wow.
of my grandmother in glitzy clothes and things.
Mm,
And then there's some more modern ones of where I've been and photographed, say, the outside of the cinema or the back of the cinema,
right.
and things like that.
Yeah. And you had some interviews with the women who were just children in
Yes.
those, yes. And you
Yeah, I
got,
had both their writings, and some of them have been very, very generous and let me go and talk to them. And I must say their understanding and insights, these were very young children.
Mhm.
The youngest, Inga, is alive and well and lives in Wimbledon, which is South London, so it's not far from me.
Mhm.
And she was 5.5 when she came. She
Wow.
came with her older sister, who was 7 or 8, not really old. And there is this, she's shown me this terrible picture of her and her older sister and a younger one who was too young to come. So her baby sister and mum didn't survive.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and Elfie, who sadly died of COVID, she told us a great deal about what it was like to move from, after all, a loving family, into a different country, a different language, a completely different education system, and to go from a warm family to an institution. There were 2 matrons to care for all these children. There was no staff. They all had to muck in, and the children all had to do things. And they were divided up, little, middle, and large. And so large had to look after middle, and middle looked after little. And of course, little were too young and needed, grown-ups looking after them. But they had to take their share of the cleaning. It was open fires, no central heating. Mrs. Ubuck, the other matron, was a celebrated cook, so they all ate well, despite we had rationing in England. But they all learned to cook, which was useful. My grandmother did sort of the accounts, and she remade all the clothes because it was rationing. The kids got hand-me-downs, which were remodeled all the time. They had to collect firewood,
Yeah.
and so some of the girls actually really, when they moved to Windermere, which is beautiful, it's in the middle of the Lake District. Some of the girls, wrote very movingly about how lovely the countryside was. This is Wordsworth's daffodils, and they wrote about bluebells and rhododendrons, but we don't go there. And they loved some of them loved the freedom of going out and getting firewood, and they all sent foraging. And others, Elfie said no, she hated it. It was cold, and the blackberries prickled their fingers, and she didn't enjoy that bit of it.
Yeah.
But she didn't. She was so sort of sensible. She said, "But we had to do it."
I'm trying to imagine that a lot of these children lost their parents who did, as you said, you mentioned one didn't make it.
One of them wrote very movingly that basically they didn't realize they were living in an orphanage. Very few children's parents did make it.
Right.
One had a couple of very few. One parent was in England throughout the war. One dad was in the army. One mum got a job close to the hostel. In fact, the daughter moved out and lived with her, but stayed in touch. And the child whose dad was in the army, her mum actually survived one of the concentration camps and was then sent to Sweden to recuperate. And what shocked me was how long it took before mum was fit to travel again. Because if you think about it, they don't have our sorts of medicine. They couldn't do, induce coma and perinatal feeding. It was how to restore someone who's been starved.
Mm-hmm.
And that was this heartrending thing that by the time mum is able to travel, her daughter and dad is out. The hostel's closed. Her daughter and dad are in Scotland, I think in Glasgow, and mum comes and goes, well, where is my child? You know, she was expecting this 7-year-old who'd left, not a young woman. This is 9 years later.
Yeah, right. Yeah. About your father, I read on your website again something about your father having joined the British military at some point.
Yes, he did a degree in Newcastle. They had places for refugees with special entry requirements for each of them. And after halfway through his first year, he was interned because they just collected all the enemy aliens, and so you sent to the Isle of Man and then Canada, and then he's sent back because they realise he's not a Nazi. Finishes his degree, and then tried to join the Navy. The RAF wouldn't take him because he had astigmatism, and so he didn't, wore glasses. That was out. And he ended up joining the minesweeping because that used his engineering. But quite quickly, he was transferred to intelligence. So he spent the end of the war and actually after the war generally in Northern Europe, going and looking at, what they needed to do was find out some German military developments were very advanced.
Mm.
And we wanted to know about that technology.
Yeah. Interesting. So far, how are book sales going for you?
But they're not wonderful. They're not terrible. I don't quite know what I should compare them with in some ways.
Well, it's not a lucrative business. It's more a business of passion. Yes, for sure.
What has been very nice is that BBC Newcastle picked up the story of the hostel and have put together some lovely podcasts which are called The Girls, and they include interviewing Inga in London and some archive recordings of some of the girls. Mm-hmm. And so that got a flurry of interest, okay. Which is, and it's nice that the story is told. So I'm getting odd presentations and talks, which I like doing anyway.
Yeah, I saw that there's a audio podcast of you on your website. I listened to it a little bit this morning.
There are a few.
Yeah. So how?
There's a link to the girls from my website.
Oh, great. Any video of you besides the one we're doing right now?
I think there might be one, but I'm not sure whether it's on the website.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely put the link to the website in the description of this video. Any final words you want to say to wrap this up?
Yes, I actually took the story right up. I've trying to work out what had happened to my grandmother's family during the war, and very few of them survived. There were 2 survivors. One was Fritzi, who survived Theresienstadt and returned to Brno, and her husband had survived a different camp, but I haven't found out which camp yet. And I did meet her in the late 70s, when the wall came down. And she was living under communism. And that taught me quite a lot, in that there were no whereas other groups got reparations, particularly if you've been in a concentration camp. Under communism, they got nothing. And then when the communists went, she did get some financial support. I mean, she was by then an old lady. And it was her common sense attitude. She was just so, well, this is what happened when we were in the camp. They beat us and we did this. Not sort of no recriminations. And anyway, so I built that up. There was, having met Fritzi, and I went on when I was working out, because I wanted to know what the old ladies had done. So I've got some little snippets of their stories, but I actually took it right up to, I've got Austrian citizenship now under the scheme for victims of National Socialism. And it's slightly controversial because many people might not want to go for it, given what happened. Mm-hmm. And that gets tied in with Brexit and other things. So unlike many of these sort of Holocaust stories, I did bring it up to date.
Well, it really makes me think again about the cruelty and the beauty that can come from that. Unfortunately, be nice if beauty can just come on its own without all that cruelty. It must have been quite cathartic for you to write this book.
It's really strange because it just started as a detective story, what's happening, or what happened. And as I found out more about people, individuals, they actually became people.
Yeah,
And at that point, when I always known that my grandmother had a sister, Zelma, but you find out more about her, that she, was widowed quite young, that her photograph, she actually looks like my sister did when she was young, and she died very miserably. I have to say that when her death certificate popped up on my screen one night, that is upsetting. As I've learned more, and particularly about the appalling killing centres in the East, that I hadn't realised quite. You know about the big concentration camps because they're, everyone's heard of Auschwitz-Birkenau and things. But the ones in the East were much more primitive, and they got through vast numbers.
hmm.
So I think there's more brutality there than we commonly think about. They may be better not thinking about it at
Yeah,
times.
yeah. Well, Vivian, it's been delightful speaking with you on this subject that you've taken such good care in writing about. And I do wish you a lot of success with your book. I think people should read this book, and maybe I'll even order a copy for myself because it's a subject close to my heart as well.
Well, that's kind. Thank you. You can get it from Amazon or Book Depository, or your local bookshop should be able to get it in, and it's on Kindle.
Okay.
But the print version's nice because the pictures look good.
I prefer print version. Yes. All right.
Thank you so much.
Vivian. Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. You know, take care of yourself.
Thanks a lot.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. If you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then please subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and don't forget to ring that bell for future notifications. And if you are an author, I would really like to speak with you. Until such time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.